The recipe for rebuilding. When war rewrites your purpose. The confession rolled across the Family Feud studio like smoke from a distant fire, heavy with loss, rich with resilience, and carrying the complex flavors of dreams deferred but not destroyed. Steve Harvey stood at his podium, his confident smile softening as he processed what he'd just heard, recognizing that this answer would expose the devastating reality of how war could completely rewrite someone's story while leaving their calling to heal and serve others unchanged. 44-year-old Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid stood at the contestant podium with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to carry multiple identities simultaneously, the accomplished physician she had been, the refugee she had become, and the entrepreneur she was now building herself into. Her dark hair was covered by a colorful hijab, and her brown eyes held the particular depth that comes from losing everything except your essential humanity and discovering that sometimes that's enough to start again. We asked 100 people, Steve had announced with his trademark enthusiasm. Name something you had to start over. He'd expected the typical responses that would generate knowing nods and maybe some inspiration. A career after a layoff, perhaps. Dating after a divorce. Life after addiction. Health after illness. The kinds of fresh starts that were challenging but ultimately manageable. The sort that would light up the board and remind everyone that second chances were part of the American experience. Instead, Dr. Al-Rashid looked directly into his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had been forced to rebuild not just her career, but her entire existence, and delivered 13 words that would transform this episode from entertainment into something approaching a masterclass in resilience, adaptation, and the different ways that healing can happen. My entire life when I escaped Syria, but lost my medical degree in the process. The studio fell into a silence so profound it seemed to absorb every comfortable assumption about immigration, professional credentials, and what it meant to be forced to abandon not just your home but your professional identity. Not the quiet of sympathy, but the devastating silence that follows a truth so complex it forces everyone to examine their own relationship to stability, security, and the things they took for granted about their ability to practice their profession. Steve's perpetual motion stilled as he recognized that this wasn't just about starting over. This was about someone whose education, expertise, and calling to heal had been rendered invisible by geography, by war, by immigration systems that didn't recognize degrees earned in countries torn apart by conflict. Behind the cameras, producers scrambled to understand what was happening. This wasn't part of any show format they'd prepared for. Contestants were supposed to share relatable restart stories, common second-chance experiences that audiences could understand and relate to. They weren't supposed to reveal the devastating professional displacement that war and forced migration could inflict on highly educated, skilled professionals. Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid had been a cardiologist in Damascus, Syria for 15 years before the civil war forced her to flee with her 2 children and whatever belongings they could carry in 2 suitcases. She had left behind not just her home, her extended family, and her country, but also her medical license, her hospital position, her patient relationships, and 20 years of education and training that American medical institutions didn't recognize or couldn't verify due to the destruction of Syrian academic records. For the past 6 years, she had been serving her new community in Portland, Oregon, not with a stethoscope but with a food truck called Healing Spice, offering Syrian cuisine that she prepared with the same precision, care, and attention to detail that had once guided her through cardiac surgeries. Dr. Al-Rashid, Steve said softly, setting down his cards and moving away from his podium. Something in her expression had triggered every instinct he'd developed over decades of reading people who carried stories of loss that most Americans couldn't imagine surviving. Tell me about Syria. The question opened floodgates that Dr. Al-Rashid had been keeping carefully controlled through years of immigration paperwork, language barriers, professional disappointment, and the daily navigation of a country that desperately needed doctors, but couldn't recognize her qualifications to practice medicine. In Syria, I was a cardiologist, she began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had given this explanation countless times to employers, immigration officials, and neighbors who couldn't understand why someone with her education was selling falafel from a truck. I worked at Damascus General Hospital for 15 years, performed hundreds of cardiac procedures, saved lives, trained medical students, published research. The Al-Rashid family stood at their team podium. Her teenage son, Omar, her daughter, Layla, her brother-in-law, Khalil, who had helped them start the food truck, and her elderly mother-in-law, Amira, all of them carrying the complex pride and grief that came from watching someone rebuild their life from scratch, while society failed to recognize their qualifications and expertise. What happened when the war started? Steve asked gently. The hospital was bombed, Dr. Al-Rashid replied, her voice steady despite the tears gather in her eyes. 3 times. The last time, we lost the cardiac unit completely. Medical supplies became impossible to obtain. Doctors were fleeing or being killed, and it became clear that we couldn't continue providing care. More importantly, it wasn't safe for my children. The rival family, the Johnson clan from Tennessee, stood frozen at their podium. They were Americans who had never questioned their ability to practice their professions, who had never imagined that education and expertise could become worthless due to circumstances beyond their control. How did you decide to leave? Steve asked. When my daughter Layla was injured by shrapnel from a bomb that hit our neighborhood school, Dr. Al-Rashid answered immediately. She survived, but I realized that staying meant watching my children grow up in a war zone. Assuming they survived to grow up at all. We left with tourist visas to Jordan, applied for refugee status, and waited 3 years for approval to come to America. The studio was completely silent now. Even the usual rustling of programs and shifting in seats had stopped. 300 people held their breath as this accomplished physician revealed the impossible choices that war forced on families, the devastating decision to abandon everything you've built for the possibility of safety. What happened to your medical career when you arrived in America? Steve asked. American medical institutions require verification of foreign credentials, Dr. Al-Rashid explained, but the Syrian Ministry of Health no longer exists in any functional form. The university where I earned my degree was bombed, the hospital where I completed my residency was destroyed, and the medical board that issued my license fled the country. I had no way to prove my qualifications. The camera caught her son Omar, watching from the family podium, 17 years old and fluent in English, serving as editor and cultural bridge for a mother whose expertise in cardiac medicine was invisible to American employers, who only saw a foreign accent and unverifiable credentials. Even if I could prove my education, Al-Rashid continued, I would need to complete a medical residency again, which requires taking exams in English, competing against American medical school graduates, and finding programs willing to accept a 40-something Syrian refugee with a 15-year gap in verifiable practice. The Johnson family found themselves emotionally invested in a story that challenged their understanding of immigration, professional displacement, and the hidden costs of seeking safety in a new country. So you started a food truck, Steve observed. I started a food truck, Dr. Al-Rashid confirmed, because I needed to support my family, because I understood that healing comes in many forms, and because food was something I could offer my new community that didn't require medical license verification. She paused, looking out at the studio audience, 300 people who represented the full spectrum of American opinions about immigrant, refugees, and whether highly skilled professionals should be satisfied with any work that helped them survive. But also, she continued, because I realized that feeding people properly is a form of medicine. In Syria, I treated patients with heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, conditions often caused or worsened by poor nutrition. In my food truck, I can serve food that prevents some of the same conditions I used to treat in the hospital. Steve found himself moving closer to Dr. Al-Rashid, drawn by recognition of someone who had found a way to continue their calling to heal and serve even when traditional pathways were blocked by circumstances beyond their control. "Tell me about your food," Steve said. "Syrian cuisine emphasizes fresh vegetables, whole grains, legumes, healthy fats from olive oil and nuts." Dr. Al-Rashid replied, her face lighting up with the same passion she had once brought to cardiac surgery. "These are exactly the foods that cardiologists recommend for heart health. I'm essentially practicing preventive medicine through traditional Syrian recipes." She reached into her apron and pulled out a small recipe card, worn from use. "This is my grandmother's recipe for kebab, but I've modified it to reduce sodium and increase fiber. I use it for customers with high blood pressure." Steve studied the card, seeing not just cooking instructions but medical intervention disguised as traditional food, healing practice adapted to new circumstances. "Do your customers know about your medical background?" Steve asked. "Some do," Dr. Al-Rashid answered. "When they have questions about nutrition, when they mention health conditions, when they need advice about diet modifications for diabetes or heart disease, then I become their informal nutritionist, their health educator, their bridge between traditional medicine and traditional food." "Give me an example," Steve requested. "Last month," Dr. Al-Rashid said, "a regular customer named Bob mentioned that his doctor had told him to reduce his cholesterol. Instead of just selling him lunch, I spent 20 minutes explaining which items on my menu would help with his condition, teaching him how Syrian spices like turmeric and sumac have anti-inflammatory properties, showing him how to modify his diet using foods from his grandmother's homeland that he'd never considered as medicine." The studio audience began to react, not with applause but with the complex sounds of people processing a story that challenged assumptions about professional value, about the different forms that expertise could take, about whether someone's worth was determined by their job title or their ability to serve others. 6 weeks later, Dr. Al-Rashid continued, Bob came back with his latest lab results. His cholesterol had improved significantly. He told me that I had helped him more than any nutritionist he'd paid to see, that my food and advice had given him hope that he could manage his health through lifestyle changes. Steve Harvey had spent decades hosting television shows, meeting thousands of people, hearing countless stories of professional achievement and personal resilience. But standing there, looking at Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid, he saw something that challenged every assumption about success, professional recognition, and what it meant to serve others in a new country that couldn't see your qualifications. "Dr. Al-Rashid," Steve said, using her title with deliberate respect, "what would you say to someone who thinks you're wasting your education by running a food truck?" "I would say," she answered, looking directly into the camera, "that education is never wasted if you continue to use it to help people. I may not be performing cardiac surgery, but I'm still practicing medicine. I'm just doing it through food instead of pharmaceuticals, through nutrition counseling instead of hospital consultations, through community service instead of emergency room procedures." The studio was completely silent as Dr. Al-Rashid continued. "And I would say that serving people food prepared with love, care, and nutritional expertise is not a step down from practicing medicine. It's a different form of the same calling, helping people live healthier, happier lives." Steve began removing his suit jacket, his movements deliberate and symbolic. The jacket was navy blue, expensive, representing success achieved through conventional pathways in stable circumstances. "Dr. Al-Rashid," Steve said, draping the jacket around her shoulders, "this jacket represents something I built while working within established systems, while my credentials were recognized and my path was clear. But you know what it doesn't represent?" She looked up at him, curious about where this was leading. "It doesn't represent innovation," Steve continued. "It doesn't represent the kind of adaptability that finds new ways to serve when traditional ways are blocked. It doesn't represent the courage it takes to start completely over, while maintaining your commitment to healing others." The jacket was too big for Dr. Al-Rashid's frame, but she wore it like a ration of the professional respect that American institutions had failed to give her. "You didn't lose your calling to heal, doctor," Steve said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just learned something profound about resilience and service. "You just found a different way to nourish people's bodies and souls. You're still a healer, you're just healing through hospitality instead of hospitals." Steve turned to address not just Dr. Al-Rashid but the entire studio, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who had just been educated about the hidden expertise that existed in unexpected places. "To everyone watching this," he said, looking directly into the camera, "Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid represents thousands of highly skilled professionals whose qualifications aren't recognized in America, but whose commitment to service continues in whatever form is available to them. The person serving your food, driving your Uber, cleaning your office, might be a doctor, an engineer, a professor whose education became invisible due to circumstances beyond their control." He turned back to Dr. Al-Rashid, his expression filled with profound respect and newfound understanding. "Your food truck isn't a consolation prize," Steve said firmly. "It's proof that calling transcends credentials, that service finds a way, regardless of official recognition, that healing can happen through any vehicle when it's guided by genuine expertise and care." The game show had been completely forgotten. This wasn't about points or prizes anymore. This was about resilience, about finding purpose when traditional pathways were blocked, about understanding that professional value couldn't be diminished by immigration status or credential recognition. "There's something I want to share," Dr. Al-Rashid said, reaching into her phone and pulling up a photo album. "These are pictures from community health fairs where I volunteer, providing nutrition education and basic health screenings. I may not have an American medical license, but I can still serve my community's health needs in ways that don't require official certification." She scrolled through photo after photo showing her at community events, teaching families about healthy cooking, demonstrating how traditional Middle Eastern foods could help manage chronic conditions, bridging cultural divides through shared understanding of food as medicine. "When I look at these pictures," Dr. Al-Rashid said, "I see proof that my medical education wasn't wasted. I'm still serving patients, I just call them customers now. I'm still practicing medicine, I just prescribe recipes instead of pharmaceuticals." The studio erupted, not in typical game show applause, but in the kind of sustained, emotional response that recognizes dignity and service when it witnesses them. Khalil al-Rashid left the family podium and crossed the stage to his sister-in-law, embracing her as the audience continued to celebrate not just her resilience, but her redefinition of what it meant to practice medicine. 6 months later, Steve Harvey received a package from Portland. Inside was a small jar of za'atar spice blend, along with a photo showing a bustling community health clinic with a sign reading Al-Rashid Family Community Health Center in English and Arabic. The note attached read, "Mr. Harvey, I wanted you to know that your recognition of my work as healing gave me courage to expand my service. We've opened a community health center that combines traditional medical care with nutritional counseling and cultural bridge building. I've partnered with American-trained doctors who recognize my expertise even if the licensing boards don't. We serve refugees, immigrants, and low-income families who need both medical care and cultural understanding." The letter continued, "My son Omar is pre-med now, planning to become a cardiologist like his mother. But he understands that healing takes many forms, that service transcends official recognition, and that sometimes the most important medicines you can offer is simply showing people that someone understands their story and wants to help them write a better chapter." Today, the Al-Rashid Family Community Health Center serves thousands of patients annually, providing culturally competent care to refugee and immigrant communities, while training American medical students about global health perspectives. Dr. Al-Rashid works as a community health educator, her medical expertise finally recognized, if not officially certified. The food truck still operates, now staffed by other refugee women learning entrepreneurial skills, while serving food that functions as both cultural bridge and health education. The recipes combine traditional flavors with modern nutritional science, proving that healing can happen through any medium when guided by expertise and care. Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid learned that credentials might be geography-dependent, but calling transcends borders. She proved that war could destroy buildings and documents but couldn't destroy knowledge, compassion, and the fundamental human drive to heal and serve others. Sometimes the most important medicine you can practice is showing people that expertise comes in many forms, and that healing happens wherever someone cares enough to nourish both body and spirit.